professor of marketing at Concordia University in Montreal, and until recently was the research chair in evolutionary behavioral sciences and Darwinian consumption. Certainly an intriguing title there, and apt. Gad Saad is a prominent proponent of evolutionary psychology, and we're going to be going into what evolutionary psychology is during our conversation today, so I'll defer that for the moment. But during his career, Gad Saad has made a name for himself using principles of evolutionary psychology to understand the psychology of consumer behavior, marketing, advertising, and many other interesting topics. Lately, he's been a prominent critic of the latest mind parasites to infect our culture, most seriously, it seems, in the academy, namely the fixation on the cult of capital letters here diversity, equity, and inclusion. Or perhaps that would be phrased more descriptively as diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I will leave it to you, the audience, to parse out the acronym for yourself. He has a prominent media presence. He has a YouTube channel, podcasts, webinars. His YouTube channel is called The Sod Truth, which attracts more than 7 million subscribers. And his podcast is equally, if not more, widely known and subscribed to. He's the author of several books, including his most famous one, The Parasitic Mind How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense, which was published in 2020. And prior to this, he published a book with nearly my favorite book title of all time, The Consuming Instinct What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature, published in 2011 by Prometheus Press. I'll be putting links to all these and more into the chat box, so please have a look and copy them at some point if you're interested. And also, we like to have question and answer in these things. Please do post questions at any time into the chat box or preferably into the Q&A box. God and I will have a conversation going for about 45 minutes, and after that, we'll open up the floor to Q&A from you, the audience. You don't have to wait until Q&A starts to post these questions. Please post them at any time, and we'll have a really nice conversation as a consequence of that. So with all that, welcome, God, to Restoring the Sciences, and we're really pleased that you're here.
Oh, I'm so glad to be with you, and it was so nice to meet you in person at my alma mater last month in at Cornell.
The pleasure was mine as well. Okay, so let's just jump right into a very basic question here. So, you describe yourself as an evolutionary psychologist, and that designation in itself is a little bit controversial. There's no shortage of people out there who criticize the whole notion of evolutionary psychology. Mostly the criticism seems to come from people conflating evolutionary psychology with sociobiology in particular, and more generally with Darwinian evolution. And so I'm not sure the validity of these kinds of things or the connections. So let's start off by clarifying what it is that you mean by evolutionary psychology. What is it?
Right.
Where is it
Yeah.
at your base?
Thank you for that opening question. It's nice to be back to my original wheelhouse of evolutionary theory. So, evolutionary psychology is a lens that I was first exposed to in my first semester as a doctoral student at Cornell. I had taken a course in advanced social psychology, and about halfway through the semester, the professor, he's now retired, Professor Dennis Regan, assigned a book to the class called Homicide, which was written by two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, husband and wife team. They were actually based out of McMaster University in Canada. And in the book, they looked at universal patterns of criminality that occur in exactly the same form, irrespective of culture and irrespective of time period. And so the idea is there might be some underlying biological slash evolutionary mechanisms that explain these invariant patterns. So example, I'll give you two because I want to kind of give the genesis of how I then developed evolutionary psychology and consumer behavior and so on. And so if you look at patterns of child abuse, social scientists have come up with a million different quote, causative agents that might predict while child abuse happens. Maybe you're born on the wrong side of the tracks. Maybe your parents were alcoholic. Maybe they were abused, so they repeated the abuse with you. And all of these have some validity. But it turns out, Scott, that the number one biggest predictor of child abuse, it's 100-fold more predictive than the next one. Now, for our viewers who may be not understanding what 100-fold means, if you're studying the pharmaceutical efficacy of a drug and it has an odds ratio of 1 to 1.2, that means it's 20% more effective. So it's 1 to 1.2. This is 1 to 100. You can only dream of such findings in science. Well, it turns out that if there is a step parent in the home, that's 100-fold greater predictor of there being child abuse. That eventually became known in the scientific literature as the Cinderella effect. The Cinderella effect, of course, comes from the universal fable of the evil stepmother, but who is strategically evil. She's only evil to her stepdaughter, but not to her two biological children. And now we have very similar patterns of differential treatment as a function of whether the children are mine or not across many animal species. In lion prides, when new dominant males come in and kick out or kill the resident dominant males, the first thing they do is kill off all the cubs that could not have been sired by them. And incidentally, that causes the lionesses to go into estrus. So I often joke with my students that if you want to get the ladies in the mood in a pride, kill their children, and then they're ready to mate with you. And so that was a big eureka moment because it demonstrated to me the parsimony and the explanatory elegance of the evolutionary framework. I'll give one other quick example, and then I'll explain what evolutionary psychology is. If you look at the most dangerous person in a woman's life throughout all time periods and all cultures, it could be the Yanomamo tribe in Amazon, it could be 1950s Detroit neighborhood. It's not the serial killer who is hiding in the bushes, it's her long-term partner. And what is the absolute, unequivocal number one reason that that guy is driven to homicidal rage? Either due to suspected or realized infidelity by his female partner. Why would that happen? Because in the human context, we're a biparental species. Therefore, males have evolved to invest quite heavily in their children, and we do have paternity uncertainty. Therefore, your ancestors and mine are not those that didn't mind if their ladies went around with 50 guys, because that would be a suboptimal evolutionary strategy. And so when I saw, and there were many, many other examples like that in the book, I had my eureka moment. I said, okay, well, I found what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this evolutionary framework. Instead of applying it to criminality, I'll apply it to the behavioral sciences in general, to decision making and consumer behavior in particular. Hence, I ended up founding the field of evolutionary or Darwinian consumption. Now, specifically, what is evolutionary psychology? There's a few key tenets. Number one, evolutionary psychology recognizes that the mind is not tabula rasa. We are not born empty slates, and it is strictly socialization that teaches us how to be. We are born with certain innate biological imperatives, and we can demonstrate that in many, many ways. So, for example, if I want to show that a child has an innate preference for facial symmetry, I can take children who are too young to have been socialized, and I can demonstrate that they already have that perceptual and sensorial penchant. Okay. So number one, the human mind does come with some biological blueprints. Number two, there's what's called the domain specificity of the human mind. So most psychologists, non-evolutionary psychologists, view the mind as an amalgamation of domain general mechanisms. So for example, our intelligence is a domain general ability. I can use my intelligence to do well in my job, to find a mate, to solve calculus problems. So it's a universal key that I can use across many domains, right? Domain specificity argues something very different. It says that yes, we have domain general mechanisms in our brain, but we also have domain specific computational systems that evolved to solve specific evolutionary problems that were recurring in our evolutionary past. Find mate, retain mate, build coalitions, invest in kin, avoid predators, and so on. So therefore, for people to understand what that means, think of the Swiss Army knife. The Swiss Army knife is made up of an amalgamation of different blades, each of which cannot be transferred to another task. I can't use the part that uncorks the wine bottle to cut butter, whereas a domain general knife, if you'd like, could be used for many different things. Okay, so evolutionary psychologists recognize that the brain is made up of both domain general and domain specific computational systems. And the third one, and then I'll stop. Forgive me for the long
Yeah.
technical answer. The third thing that evolutionary psychologists posit, although it applies not just to evolutionary psychologists, but to evolutionists in general, is that we recognize that scientific explanations operate at two epistemological levels. The proximate level, which explains the how and the what of a phenomenon. How does diabetes work? What are the factors that increase your proclivity to get diabetes? So, and much of science operates at the proximate level. Most Nobel Prizes have been won at the proximate level. That's great. But here is where the evolutionary lens offers something unique. They offer what's called the ultimate explanation. Ultimate doesn't mean superior. It means ultimate in that if you unfold the causal chain, it answers the ultimate Darwinian why. Why did the mechanism evolve to be of that form? Why have we evolved romantic jealousy? Why have we evolved sexual territoriality? Why do women experience pregnancy sickness? So when you're studying any biological agent, if you only restrict your explanation to the proximate world, you're only getting part of the answer. If you study the phenomenon at both proximate and ultimate levels, now you fully understand something. So that's what
Yeah.
evolutionary psychology is.
Okay. All right. So, I've been looking around for a long time at critiques of evolutionary psychology, and just to make a general point that we might expand on a little bit later. People have, I think, a very great difficulty in looking at these problems from multiple epistemological levels, as you've said. And one of the criticisms, well, some of the criticisms that I've seen seem to conflate evolutionary psychology with kind of a very crude gene selectionism, which is almost a kind of genetic determinism, and they use genetic determinism as a kind of well, the critique is that you're using genetic determinism as a means of kind of a social Darwinist idea that because it has benefited reproduction, that somehow it's been selected for, and that somehow in some strange way justifies the behavior, and so this seems to be a problem that runs through a lot of controversies in biology right now. You can see it in the whole transgender issue, for example, and we've had some interviews with just some fascinating critics of the whole transgender ideology. It seems that the argument is you have to either go completely gene determinist or you have to go completely to tabula rasa. And yet biology is a little bit of both, right? I mean,
That
if you understand this, if you understand the biology, you'll know that there's a certain amount of adaptability, flexibility, these kinds of things in any basically cognitive system, even if it's as sophisticated as a human brain, for example, or a human mega brain, the social brain, if you will, right down to things like microbial mats and those kind of things. They also have a kind of odd sort of intelligence. And in every case, there's a component of genetic heredity, and there's also a component of adaptability, flexibility, and those kinds of things. So how do you respond to people who are criticizing evolutionary psychology as a kind of, crude Darwinian genetic determinism?
Yes.
What's your argument that you bring
Yeah,
to bear on that?
that's a fantastic question. And actually, you were kind enough in the introduction to mention one of my earlier books, the 2011, The Consuming Instinct, with the subtitle that you so appreciated. In that book, in the chapter one, I actually go through some of the main uh, positions that detractors of evolution in general and evolutionary psychology make, and I then offer a rebuttal. So I'll certainly address the ones that you raised, but I can certainly address a few others. So let's first
Sure.
talk about the genetic or slash biological determinism argument. You are exactly right. And when someone makes the argument that evolutionary psychology is biologically deterministic, they're simply saying, I am an utter imbecile who doesn't understand a thing about biology. Because exactly to your point, and what evolutionists call the interactionist framework, it's exactly what you said, which is for most uh, you know, important phenomena that we might talk about for any species, let alone humans, it really is an interaction between our genes and our environment. Even specifically, genes get turned on or off as a function of environmental inputs. Evolution itself operates within a specific environment. So it is absolutely incorrect to presume that once you believe that evolutionary forces shape, let's say, the human mind, that means that we are just invariant executors of our genetic imperatives. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, that sounds all very sort of fancy science language. So let me put it more concretely. There is a universal mechanism that makes them compelled to seek status, because status is the universal preference that women have across all studied cultures. Like, there is no culture that's ever been studied where women say, you want to maximize your chances of mating with me, please be apathetic, pear-shaped, nasal voiced, unambitious, beta, never wants to do anything. Boy, that gets me into a sexual frenzy. On the other hand, women say, I want an ambitious, creative, go-getter, socially dominant, so on. Okay. Even if they might not be rich, the men, but if they're exhibiting cues of ambition, right? That's why women are attracted to the starving potential future rock stars. They may not have any money, but they exhibit drive, ambition, creativity, talent. Okay. Well, the universal mechanism might be seek status, but the specific manifestation of how each of us instantiate that imperative is completely different. I may decide to become a famous soccer player. You may decide to be a famous politician. The next guy might become a great opera singer. So it is an interaction between that biological imperative of seeking status and the idiosyncratic personal trajectory and talents of each of our individual personhoods. So, no, being an evolutionary psychologist does not in any way imply that you are a genetic determinist. As a matter of fact, one of the disciplines within the greater evolutionary behavioral sciences, that's the chair that I held, as you kindly pointed to in the introduction, behavioral ecology is the study of cross-cultural differences across populations, precisely in recognition of the fact that we've evolved plasticity. Adaptability is itself an adaptation. The immune system is adaptable, and that's the adaptation. So it is such a laughably incorrect view. Now, the reason why it triggers my ire is because it's the phoenix that never dies. Every generation, a new tsunami of imbeciles comes along and gives us the exact same arguments, and then you write yet another paper that demonstrates that it's completely false, and then the next generation comes and raises the exact same point. So there's never any cumulative learning at the core knowledge level. Some of your other arguments, if you provide an evolutionary explanation, you're justifying it or condoning it. That's one of the classic ones. So if you explain why child abuse happens, you are lending credence to why it is natural for it to happen. Usually the analogy that I offer that hopefully makes them, understand it. An oncologist studies cancer. Who would say that that means he or she is for cancer? He is justifying cancer. He is condoning cancer. People will say, no, of course that doesn't mean that. It's the same thing. Studying the evolutionary signature of rape or murder or domestic violence or child abuse doesn't mean we are condoning it or justifying it. It means to the extent that they are part of the repertoire of human reality, we have to offer a valid explanation. So yes, I've gone through all those detractors, and boy, they are immortal. They never go away.
So are we winning or are we losing, Good? What do you think?
Well, I want to be optimistic. So I think that if I were, so maybe I hate to say it, but I'm now old enough. I've been a professor. I'm about to enter my 31st year. I can't believe that that's true. I still think of myself as a 12-year-old wide-eyed kid. If I compare the reaction of my social science colleagues to all of my evolutionary stuff in 1994, 95, 98 to now, I'd have to say unequivocally that there's more acceptance of it. In other words, many of the people who thought, what kind of baloney is this that Gad Saad is doing with all this evolution stuff? Now they come around and they invite me to be the plenary speaker at their thing. So there's certainly in 20, 25, 30 years, there's been improvement, but maybe it's my impatience that says, but why is it even something that we have to debate, right? To me, anybody who doesn't somehow see the relevance of applying evolution to explain the most important organ in our personhood called our brain is, I call them flat earthers of the human mind, right? It should really be in the least bit contestable that, I mean, if our pancreas evolved through evolution, if our opposable thumbs are due to evolution, I often joke that many of those folks say, but yeah, that's all good, but it stops right here. Anything above here cannot be due to evolution. So we are winning, but very small W. I'd like it to be a definitive mic drop win.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about the scientific inquiry stopping at the neck, this is one of the striking things to me about the whole bun fight over race and intelligence. I mean, you would not be troubled by saying that people of African descent will have, slightly different physiology and these kinds of things as results of selection in their environment. Sickle cell anemia being the classic example of this. And and yet we're upset by the fact that, well, of course, why can't cognition be a part of that variability, and why can't intelligence be a part of that variability? And it has nothing to do with higher or lower or inferior or superior or white supremacy or any of these kinds of things. But for some reason, the Overton window, if you will, has been closed on those kinds of things, and so you get a very kind of inconsistent, dissonant way of thinking about this. Some things can fit comfortably under this, dual epistemology, but others, you just have to kind of stay away from it. And why do you think that is? Why is it that people have this very narrow Overton window when it comes to that sort of thing?
Well, so because they are instantiating what I think is a dreadful idea in science, which is forbidden knowledge, right? If you
Hmm.
remember the movie, the name of the rose, I think it was called. It was a
Hmm.
movie in the mid '80s following a famous book, an adaptation of a
Yeah,
famous book,
yeah,
where there is this. I think he was a Benedictine monk played by
yes,
Sean Connery, who goes to
yes.
this monastery during I think it was the late Dark Ages, if I'm not mistaken, where
Hmm.
all of these monks are dying in mysterious ways, and they have this blue kind of dot on their tongues and they don't know what it is. And it turns out, and of course, I'm going to come back and link it to your question. And it turns out that it's because the head monk had this forbidden library where Aristotle's book on humor, uh, had been sealed there, and he didn't want them to read that book because, you know, humor is the work of the devil, or whatever the theological position was. And yet these monks who were hungry for Aristotle's knowledge would go to the forbidden library and would read the book, and as they would turn the pages, he had laced the pages with poison, and therefore they would eventually die. Now, why am I saying all this? Is because the reflex for someone to come along, in French, you say les bien pensants, the better thinkers, the anointed ones, right? There
Yeah.
is someone who should tell us what is appropriate to explore, to read, to think, what is settled science, what is not. And so, to your question, once you study sex differences, once you study racial differences, then you are attacking one of the most fundamental parasitic ideas that I discuss in this yellow book, The Parasitic Mind, which is that men and women are indistinguishable from each other, and any differences that exist could only be due to socialization. All racial groups, all cultures are equal. How dare you say that this culture's belief system might be viewed as barbaric? Then you're imposing your cultural imperialism on them. So Franz Boas, a Jewish
Mhm.
anthropologist nearly 100 years ago,
Yeah.
started the whole program of cultural relativism, and then that led to many of his famous doctoral students, Margaret Mead and so on, arguing that there is no such thing as a human universal. There isn't a single thing that you can lay your hat on as a human universal. Well, the average 3-day-old squirrel knows that that's false. What do you mean there are no universal? There is no culture where this frown, look at this frown, where
Mhm.
this means I'm happy. We haven't found that culture. There is no culture, notwithstanding Margaret Mead's attempt to argue that she had found such a culture, which was complete
Right.
nonsense. There is
Yes.
no culture where women are not more sexually judicious than men. It doesn't exist. And the answer is very simple, because the cost of making a poor mate choice looms larger for women than it does for men, and that is true across any culture, across any time period. So that's the reason. So to answer your question, and again in a perhaps slightly
Mhm.
long-winded way, it's
Mhm.
because we've created these parasitic ideas that are very noble and hopeful, but that are perfectly rooted in nonsense.
Mhm. Yeah. So, most of the applications of evolutionary psychology as you practice it, I gather, have been in the business world, how to create effective advertising and understanding consumer mentality and those kinds of things. So there are some obvious things one could say about that. You know, you use sexual attractiveness to flog products and those kinds of things. But what's the most um, uh, paradoxical, the most almost contrary prediction that's come out of your studies in this?
Very good. Before I try to answer that, it actually is. I mean, yes, of course, using sex to sell is an obvious one,
Yeah.
but
Hmm.
my 30+ year research, does a lot less obvious stuff. So let me give you examples.
Hmm.
We know that across many species, females of that species go into estrus, and when they go into estrus, meaning they become sexually receptive, they exhibit all sorts of very conspicuous cues to say, hey, I'm open for business, so to speak. Well, in the human context, it's not quite as explicit in how conspicuous it is. But so I did a study with one of my former graduate students where we looked at how do women beautify themselves as a function of where they are in their menstrual cycle. And as you might expect, if you are evolutionary minded, when they are in the maximally fertile phase of their menstrual cycle, that's when they really engage in vigorous sexual signaling. Here's another study. And again, it's all coming from an understanding of the animal kingdom, right? And that's the beauty of being an evolutionist, is that you could look at homologies and analogies across species in order to make certain predictions for humans in general and consumers in particular. So I did a study with one of my other graduate students where we wanted to demonstrate the effects of testosterone on wins and losses. We know from a cross species that, let's say, when two males fight, the winner will have a rise in testosterone and the loser will have a drop in testosterone. Well, how might that manifest itself in an economic/consumer context? Well, we got men to drive either a fancy Porsche or a beaten up old sedan, and we took salivary assays before they drove those cars and after they drove their cars. And of course, as most of your audience can probably predict at this point, we found that when you put young men in a Porsche, their endocrinological system explodes because I have immediately imbued you with huge social status via the interaction, ownership of a high status product. So it's not always, applying evolutionary theory to better create advertisements, although that could certainly be the case. I'm really trying to examine the signatures of our human nature in a modern context. That would be the way that I would describe it. Now, what are some things that have surprised me? So I was recently asked on a show that I appeared on. It was hosted by a British psychiatrist. He asked me at the end of the show, so kind of to your question, what is the singular phenomenon that you have become aware of in your 30 years as a professor and evolutionary scientist that surprised you the most? And so in a sense, it's a broader question than what you asked. And my answer to that, after thinking for about 20, 30 seconds, is the inability for humans to change their minds once it is anchored in a position, irrespective of the amount of evidence that I can offer you to get you to change your mind. But now I'm going to offer an evolutionary twist to it. So I am going to link it to your question. There is a great book written by two French psychologists where they argued that our capacity to reason did not evolve in the pursuit of some abstract notion of truth, but rather our faculty of reasoning evolved to win arguments, right? So once you put it that way, then you understand the reflex of people go, la, 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 I don't want to hear it, right? And so that even if so one of the things that I do in chapter 7 of the Yellow Book, The Parasitic Mind, I talk about this incredibly powerful tool, which I call nomological networks of cumulative evidence. When I'm trying to demonstrate to you that a phenomenon, let's say, is an adaptation, how will I go about doing that? Well, I will get you data from across cultures, across species, across time periods, across methodologies, across dependent measures, all of which triangulate to showing you that my position is the veridical one. Well, that's a great methodology as long as my interlocutor has the intellectual honesty to allow me to present that evidence to him. If the interlocutor goes, la, 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 I'm never going to agree to your position because I simply can't accept that I will ever be anchored away from my position, then I can't administer the mind vaccine to you. So I think that's probably the most disheartening and most surprising thing that I have found about the human mind.
Okay. Um, so turning just briefly to, if this is a parasitic disease or something along those lines, these memes that lead people into incoherent or illogical things. Um, it can either be an epidemiological phenomenon where you can measure spread and persistence of these memes or whatever you want to call them in the population, and I think you implied your answer in your last response, which is that if you want to cure people of this, you need to administer some kind of medicine, if you will, and the medicine is evidence, logic, these kinds of things which people are resistant to. But the other is that, and in the introduction, I mentioned that, well, maybe there's a kind of Gresham's law operating here. The whole analogy of bad money tends to drive out good, and there are really two explanations for Gresham's law. I got into this actually and found it quite fascinating. One of them is that the well-known one, which is that bad money drives out good, and the reason for that is that bad money stays in circulation because nobody wants to hang on to it. You want to take the good money and you want to hold it to yourself. That's the logical thing. But the other reason for it, and some economists have mentioned this, is that Gresham's law operates actually through government action, mostly in the case of manipulating exchange rates, and these kinds of things can keep under government fiat can keep bad money circulating and drive out the good. And this is leading up to kind of my question, which is that these ideas, which are very destructive, very damaging to our society, to what extent is this kind of a government or elite manipulation of the intellectual currency that we deal with?
Right. Now
Do you think
that's a
that?
great. Yeah, go
Do
ahead.
you,
Finish your point.
I was saying, do you think there's something to that we're getting it because we're subsidizing it?
Right. I mean, there could be a bit of that. So in the
Mhm.
parasitic mind, I actually try to answer that question by asking the following. To the extent that these parasitic ideas are able to infect so many people, why are they so alluring, right? So so if I got the idea for the neuroparasitological framework from studying neuroparasitology in the animal kingdom, right? There are an incredible number of examples where there is a parasite. So parasitology is just the study of the interaction between parasites and hosts. So a tapeworm is a parasite, but it's going in your intestinal tract, whereas a neuroparasite is looking to find its ultimate destination in the host's mind. And usually what it does is it alters the circuitry of the host to suit typically its reproductive interest. So the wood cricket despises water, but when it is parasitized by the hairworm, then it merely jumps and commits suicide by jumping into water because the hairworm needs to be in water to complete its reproductive cycle. So now taking that framework and hence applying it for the parasitic mind, but so, okay, so why do these parasitic ideas, infect so many people? And so there I argued that they are alluring because they free us from the pesky shackles of reality. In a sense, they are liberating, right? It's nice to know that I am not bound by my genitalia. I could be a woman even though I have a penis. I could, as a matter of fact, I could be 74,000 different genders and sexes. That's liberating, in quotes. It's liberating to succumb to the social constructivist neuroparasite. Social constructivism is we're born tabula rasa and it's only social construction that makes us who we become. Well, that's very liberating to a parent. Why? Because as a parent, I love the idea that when my child is born, he or she has an equal chance of becoming the next Lionel Messi, the next Albert Einstein, or the next Michael Jordan. Because then if only I hug them enough or not enough, or hug them in the right amount of schedule of reinforcement, they too could be the next Lionel Messi. I don't want to hear that there is an innate biological potentiality difference between my child and Michael Jordan when he was born, that Michael Jordan simply had a greater chance of becoming an NBA star. That's not a very hopeful message. So I'd rather live in unicornia and believe that message, right? And so I can take each of those parasitic ideas, Scott, and demonstrate to you that using kindergarten logic, they're very alluring. So that's why you often have the young folks who are first most likely to be wokesters. That's why people start off loving La Revolution, Che Guevara, Marxism, and then they grow out of it because they realize that that's not how life operates. We are not social ants, as E.O. Wilson told us. Communism, great idea, wrong species, he said, right? So the reason why these parasitic ideas, so to your question, I don't think there is a cabal, like a Davos cabal that said, brouhaha, how should we screw with people? I think what happened is that these parasitic ideas all were spawned on university campuses, always originally with a perfectly noble reason why they were spawned, but perfectly incorrect. And then they came together in a devastating cocktail. Like life is about timing. And so all of these parasitic ideas came together, and then they created Justin Trudeau, who's called our prime minister. So he becomes the walking manifestation of every parasitic idea that he was exposed to in his nonsensical posh schools in Quebec, right? So my feeling is it's a lot less willful and a lot more organic nonsense that started on university campuses.
So have the universities failed then?
Have the universities failed? Is that what you asked?
Yes.
So I actually address that in the parasitic mind, in that I
Mhm.
say that notwithstanding the fact that I'm being very critical of the university ecosystem, I'm still a very staunch defender of the university model, as
Mhm.
long as it is wedded to intellectual enrichment, to logic, to science, to reason, to evidence-based thinking. So it hasn't failed in that I don't think we need to scratch universities and start with something new. I think, though, that bad ideas wax and wane. We've always, by the way, humans have always been parasitized by bad ideas. What's unique about the current moment is the specific ideological parasites that have infected our brains, right? I can give you endless examples throughout history of other parasitic ideas that people succumb to, right? I mean, let's throw the woman in the water, and if she swims, then she is a witch, and if she drowns, oh, oops, I guess she wasn't a witch. Okay, so it's not as though this is a unique moment where the human mind has suddenly failed. It's always had a proclivity to find parasitic ideas alluring. It's just that these unique cocktail of parasitic ideas are going to destroy the world.
Well, this is where the subsidization argument of Gresham's law comes in, because there's a certain demographics of the university population of academics, as you well know, and people respond rationally to incentives and disincentives, and it seems that what we have now, and I've witnessed this from the time I began as an assistant professor, too many years ago to actually say explicitly right now, but the faculty seem to have been replaced by a growing cohort of professors who are immersed in this woke ideology, this kind of postmodernist idea. And as a consequence, uh, university professors, there's still very fine people there who are wedded to the ideals that we're talking about for the university. But there's a very and growingly powerful cohort of people who don't buy into that anymore. And we're seeing this in the eruptions that have been going on campuses for a long time. I was in college at the time that when Richard Nixon started bombing Cambodia and all the disruption that went along with that. But of course, we're seeing the same thing again now in a rather alarming. What's the word I want? I want to say inflorescence, but there's a fulmination is the word that I'm looking for, of mobilization against Israel and the defense of their own country against what are arguably atrocities that were committed against it by Hamas. And you know, the professors are right out there supporting this, and you've been out there as well prominently arguing against it. You mentioned Cornell at the beginning of our conversation. You were there actually to uh, make some very powerful comments on the expansion of tent cities, the disturbing level of anti-Semitism that's going on in there, and this ties into your personal story. You're Jewish and you came from Lebanon and you left there under some uh, rather alarming circumstances. To what extent did your experience as someone who basically is a refugee from Lebanon, how's that influenced your reaction and your mobilization
Yes.
against what's going on campuses?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. In several ways. So let me start with the following. Lebanon was the perfect model of what happens to a society that's organized according to the ethos of identity politics. Because Lebanon, I mean, literally in its constitution, it says the prime minister has to be of that religion, the president has to be of that religion, the number of seats that this group gets is this much because of that demographic reality. You get one this for that, and so on. So everything in Lebanon, whether it be institutionally, politically, or in daily interactions, or whom you invite to parties, is viewed in this case not whether you're transgender or not, or gay or not, it's what your religious affiliation is. As a matter of fact, in Lebanon, you had internal ID cards that you had to carry if, let's say, the police stopped you or a militia group stopped you. In Arabic, that card is called hawiyya, and the most conspicuous element of that card is what religion you are. So in our case, we are Jewish. It wasn't even written in Arabic. Jewish is Yehudi. You wouldn't say Yehudi. It was written Israeli, Israelite. So it even created greater animus. You somehow lost your Lebanese identity, even though we were Lebanese. We speak Arabic. We're not Israeli. We're Lebanese. Happen to be Jewish, but we're Lebanese. We're Arabic. So as I saw how the progressives adopted the ethos of identity politics, I said, well, let me tell you what happens at the extreme when a society becomes fully tribal and entrenched in its identity politics orientation. So that's certainly one way that my personal history, affected my subsequent engagement. More generally, though, and I think I can't remember if I mentioned this in one of in the talk that you're referring to at Cornell. It turns out, Scott, as you may have noticed, that some of the staunchest defenders of the Western tradition are often immigrants, are often refugees. And the reason for that is actually not very mysterious. It's because we have sampled from the entire buffet of societies that exist. And therefore, we know that the default society is not the one that you see in the West. As a matter of fact, the one that you see in the West is a bleep. It's an anomaly. It's an outlier of historically how societies were organized. And so we come along to the West and we stand on top of the mountain and we start screaming really loudly, be careful, you're replicating that which I escaped from. It's not going to end pretty. Whereas the Americans and the Canadians, they're playing the John Lennon Imagine song and Life is Beautiful and so on. So they can't know what's down the pipeline because they can't imagine that such a reality exists. So it is incontestable that the fact that I've had my personal tragic history has shaped my future engagement. So, for example, here's a more concrete example. I don't want the West to be Islamized. No sane person should. That doesn't mean that there aren't millions upon millions of lovely Muslim people. There are nice Muslims, mean Muslims, nice Jews, mean Jews. No one contests that. But do I want a society where Islam has an ever-growing presence in the West? No. Why? Because we've got 1,400 years of data that suggests that if that happens, and if you care about personal liberties and freedoms, it's probably not going to increase those freedoms. It's not Islamophobic, it's not bigoted, it's not racist, it's called having a brain. And so, of course, my personal history has shaped some of my public positions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as one would expect. And speaking of your observation that the people who are most appreciative of Western values here are immigrants. We've had some presence at the AAAS meetings, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and as we all know, they've gone full identity politics in their organization. And so we had our exhibit set up at the AAAS meeting last year, and people would walk by, kind of like this and so forth. But the people who came up to us with complimentary things to say, they were invariably from Russia or Eastern Europe, people who had experienced depression, people from the Indian subcontinent who had been immersed still in these ideals of inquiry, free inquiry, and so forth, and refugees from China. So it's really true. But again, there's this demographic issue. You have this a large class of people in universities that don't actually subscribe to this anymore, and I'm very troubled by that.
I hear you.
So I see that we've got questions coming into the Q&A. Thank you for those. We're about 15 minutes in, so why don't we go to the Q&A discussion? And as I said, feel free to put in your comments at any time, questions, either in the chat box or the Q&A. But as I said, we prefer Q&A. So let's go to Q&A right now, and we'll just go through and have a look and see what's interesting there. So let's see here. All right. So here's a little bit of a challenging question from Richard Allen. So at the Battle of Midway, Torpedo Squadron 8, all the pilots tried to attack Japanese ships. All 16 of the TBFs were shot down. 45 of the 48 men in the squadron died. So is this an evolutionary trait?
I don't follow the question. I don't get it.
Perhaps,
What's the
Richard, you,
evolutionary trait? What does that mean?
yeah. I think he means, and Richard, if you want to chime in here and clarify this, I think he means what's the evolutionary value of people sacrificing themselves with a high degree of certainty in a war. I think
Oh,
that's
I
what,
see.
what he's aiming at.
So there are several ways I could answer that. So one of the ways, so do you remember how earlier you referenced the subtitle of The Consuming Instinct? It said
Hmm.
what juicy burgers, Ferraris, pornography, and gift giving reveal about human nature. Why am I mentioning this? Because I argue in my work that you can pretty much use four key Darwinian modules to explain much of purposive behavior of humans, including consumers. It can be related to the survival instinct. It could be related to the mating drive. It could be related to kin selection, hence kin altruism, or it could be related to reciprocal altruism. And let me explain what those are, the last two, and then we'll link it to Richard's question. So why would a organism, whether it be a human organism or other animal, why would you ever take the massive risk of dying to save three of your family members? If evolution operated at the organism level, then there should never be an evolutionary pressure for such altruism to arise. It should never be valuable from an evolutionary perspective for me to give up my life in the service of helping. But if I understand, and hence this is the sort of the Richard Dawkins 1976 book, that I understand that things should that mechanism should or selection should operate at the gene level. Well, then if I jump into the river to save three of my children, each of which on average shares half of their genes with me, and if I die in the service of that heroic act, that's perfectly fine. And so there are very clear arguments for why kin-based altruism arises. But now we come to Richard's question, which is reciprocal altruism. Okay, we have a mechanism to explain why I jump into the river to save three of my children. But why do I jump into the river to save Scott, who's just a friend? Or even better, Scott, who's a random stranger, right? We have many of these heroic acts. And so here it's Robert Trivers' understanding of why reciprocal altruism would evolve. And that is that in the case of a highly social animal where it makes sense for us to develop these bonds of reciprocity, where today I will scratch your back, tomorrow you will scratch mine. That's why, by the way, we're very, very attuned to social cheaters. If I constantly invite you for dinner and I notice that you never reciprocate, I'm probably not going to be your friend because I realize that you're a social parasite. And so the idea is that many of these grand heroic acts, say in the military context, as it's right, what do you call them? Band of brothers. You use kin-based terms to describe the bonds of affiliation. As a matter of fact, many soldiers, when they come back from war, can't love their families as much as they love the guys that they were in the trenches were with, because those decisions that we were facing at that moment were literally, I'm jumping left and right to save you with the expectation that you would do the same for me, is what keeps us alive. And so that's the grand framework to explain why we engage in such unbelievably altruistic and heroic acts, even amongst non-kin.
Yeah, and of course, it doesn't even have to extend to these very heroic acts of sacrificing your life. I mean, David Sloan Wilson has dealt with this in a big way. You know, it's altruism can work just to benefit communities. You know,
Yep.
to lift everybody up and so forth. So you know, it can work in a
Yeah.
multiplicity of ways. But when we're talking about say reciprocal altruism in communities, we're getting very close to ideas, and I'm not saying this is the bad thing, but we're getting very close to ideas that that's a lot of critics of evolutionary psychology don't want to deal with, which is that, well, you know, civic virtue is a thing. You know, it's the evolutionary value of it is that you know a group of people with a certain amount of civic virtue will participate in communities that actually do better than those that don't, and so Richard, I hope this answered your question, but you know, this does I think get into well, actually it gets us away from the kind of crude genetic determinism
Right.
that you find even in a thing that's supposedly rigorous kin selection. You know,
Right.
there's the whole theory of you know, collective inheritance and those kinds of things. Interestingly enough, by the way, that this argument works very well for Hymenoptera and for bee colonies and ant colonies. The skewed sex ratios of males and females there, it works very well for that, but it doesn't for termites, which have an entirely different form of sex determination. And
Oh, I can tell I'm speaking to a biologist.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, that's just me getting my biology geek hat on. But yeah, it's okay. So let's go on to another question. Our friend Randy Wayne from Cornell, who we
Oh,
both
what
know,
a
but
I Randy is what a scholar should aspire to be. Gentleman and a scholar.
I once called him the professor's professor. So it's
That's very true.
yeah. Anyway, so he asked a question. Evolutionary psychology exactly explains why my university colleagues think there is no such thing as cancel culture, and that FIRE, the group Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, I think it is now, is a far right wing organization. There's some peculiar dynamics going on there. What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, I mean, I is he meaning it facetiously or is he being serious in linking it to evolutionary theory? I think he's doing it with a wink, wink.
I think
If
so.
I'm hearing Randy's voice.
hmm hmm
Uh, so why is it that academics tend to over apply the "you're a far right Nazi" to anybody who is to the right of them? Is that sort of the more rephrasing of that sentence?
I think so. I think he might be referring, and Randy, you can chime in here if I'm getting this wrong, that there's a kind of denialism. I hate to use that word, but denialism amongst his colleagues that refuses to see a problem and is likely to try to, you know, purge the community of
Yes.
whoever's expressing that.
So I do describe that in the parasitic mind. I have a chapter, an entire chapter on what I call ostrich parasitic syndrome, OPS.
Mhm.
Well, OPS, of course, I mean, we know that the ostriches don't literally, burrow their heads in the sand, but the metaphor has become understood to mean I don't want, I want to deny reality, la la la, by putting my head in the sand. So it doesn't matter how much evidence you show me, that's not true. That must be a right-wing conspiracy. So I think that while it is absolutely true what Randy's saying, that definitely academics suffer from OPS, I regret to inform the audience that that's an indelible part of the architecture of the human mind, right? There is no diabetes because my family nor I have ever had diabetes, right? There is no anti-Semitism until some wealthy Jewish billionaires had it knock them over the head at their alma mater. Then they woke up to this thing called anti-Semitism. But until it came in the shower with them, they didn't know it existed. They were busy doing other stuff. That's, I think, the difference between, the ones who, I guess, suffer from Cassandra's curse. I think that's the right reference, right? The ones who stand on top of the mountain and say, I'm warning you, it's coming. This is what's coming down the pipeline. And most people say, I don't want to hear it. I'm busy. I have to get my daughter's prom dress tonight. I've got to pick up the mushrooms that my wife told me to pick up. So there is an existential myopia such that I don't need to worry about those things. And as long as they don't affect me personally, they probably don't exist. It's a way to cope with the world. It's a very inefficient way to cope with the world because instead of stopping the problem today, you're waiting that it's 10 steps ahead before you intervene. So I don't think it's a unique reality of academics. I think it's just the reality of most people. They'll only respond once it hits them directly and personally. Then they suddenly realize that, oops, we have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this in academia, and in particular among academics in the STEM professions. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I've run into innumerable people who have said who are actually surprised that this pernicious development that's actually been unfolding in the academy for about 2 decades now, that all of a sudden it's consuming them, and that's a sad reality. And this is
Exactly.
where and this is where the demographic starts to come in. The people who still hold on to those values are old, like me. For example, they're close to retirement, and their natural response is to keep the head in the sand. Hope that, well, I'm very close to retirement. Why rock the boat now? And they're being replaced, I think, by uh, uh, a more aggressive cohort that actually lashes out and lashes out against people who still hold those ideas. And this is one of the reasons why cancel culture is becoming prominent among scientists. One of the surprising things, well, one of my surprising experiences was taking a stand on something like, well, no, you can't tell me how to teach. And the most vociferous opponents of that, opposition to that, is actually coming from my own colleagues, my younger colleagues. And anyway, I'm not sure how we correct that, because these people enjoy the protections of tenure, as they should. Nothing against tenure, but it's going to make it very, very hard, I think, to get our culture back
Can
to
I
what
can I
it should be. Yes,
can I
please.
just add one quick thing before you go to the next question?
Yes, of course.
So two additional things that I think are endemically problematic in academia, and I think I might have mentioned this in a private conversation with Randy, if he's still there. Number one, many academics or universities in general view their number one mission is to be, good activists before being good intellectuals, right? So, intellectual pursuits take a backseat to being a good citizen of activism. No, my job as a professor is to create and disseminate knowledge, not to be an activist for cause A, B, or C. Yes, I defend truth, I defend freedom, so I defend these deontological principles, but it's not for me to elevate marginalized voices. No, I'm here to understand human nature better and hopefully to add to the pantheon of human knowledge. The second thing that I think, if you were to ask me what has been the most disappointing thing that I've seen amongst my academic colleagues, so I'm going to answer it. It's how astonishingly intellectual most professors are, right? There's a difference between being called a professor and being an intellectual. Now, you'd like to think that those two are completely, they're to say one is to say the other, but it's no longer true because many academics are careerist academics. Whereas if I can speak of myself, but I can certainly speak on behalf of Randy because I've had the pleasure of communicating with him many times. He's the professor's professor because he embodies what you should be. We can talk about the philosophy of aesthetics, or we can talk about group selectionism of David Sloan Wilson, or I could ask him about plant physiology, which I know very little about, meaning that I am infinitely intellectually inquisitive and curious. I want to know everything there is to know in the world, even though I know very little of what there is to know in the world. That's what an intellectual is. Most of my academic colleagues can't say an intelligent syllable outside the silo of their very narrow, hyper specialized field. They're complete babbling morons. That's not what an intellectual is. So yes, you can be called Professor Doctor so and so. That doesn't make you an intellectual. So what I would love to see as a sort of a general, reinvigoration of the intellectual spirit in our academia. Let's go together to the faculty lounge today and talk about the philosophy of beauty. Let's get an intellectual orgasm going. Most academics are, how do I bullshit some paper so that I could get another paper so I can get tenure? And that has always turned me off. On the one hand, it made me the pariah of a lot of my colleagues because they knew that I wouldn't play along with their scamming. On the other hand, it's allowed me to have a much bigger platform than all of them combined.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the platform's a thing, but of course, this comes back to the Gresham's law subsidy argument. Stephen Turner and Gerald Chubin published a very interesting paper in Issues in Science and Technology a few years ago, and they made the point that the entire ethic of science has changed since the expansion of government money, NSF, and all the extramural programs into academia where it had not been before. And they have a very compelling way of speaking about it. They talk about we've moved from an ethic of discovery where you're valued and encouraged to discover new things, to do exactly what you said, to, go into the faculty lounge and talk about I forget what the example
A
was, the
philosophy
philosophy.
of beauty.
That's what yeah, okay, yeah, thanks for that. I mean, fascinating subject, and now we're in an ethic of productivity where increasingly academics are judged by numbers, which usually have nothing to do with what we're supposed to be as intellectuals. We all know the drill: numbers of publications, citation index, H index, number of students, numbers of grant dollars that you bring in, and this is the climate of incentives and disincentives as operating in the present academic ecosystem, and it's just killing the intellectual aspect of it. And yet we're paying big money to make that happen. And I'm not
Exactly.
sure most of my colleagues really understand what's going on around them. Primarily because we're there primarily to explore the endless frontier, to use Vannevar Bush's words. So. Okay, well, let's go on to some other questions. John Weiss has a series of questions here, and I'm just trying to sort out what's from there. Uh, it says bad ideas make us take leaps of faith, leaving the old worth to travel across the ocean to an unknown fate with no money and no contracts. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think there's a lot of money and contracts being pushed into this. But anyway, we can discuss that. Socially, like best made powerful. He goes on to say, looked at differently discussing the Gaza thing. I think about Jacques Barzun from Dawn to Decadence, the rise and fall of empires, but aren't people inherently tribal to some extent? And he's concludes with saying, looking at the Jewish religion, it's very difficult to comprehend how secular Jewish folks accept these tenets while Hasidic and others are disturbed by the liberal ideas infecting society. Um, I think you can see these questions if you just look at the
Oh,
Q&A
where do I
there.
go? Is it in the Q&A chat box?
Yes, that's right. The Q&A, yeah, down at the bottom.
Hold on. So
So,
I've got it. Sorry, I'm putting on which one? I'm
yeah,
going to the bottom. Not
yeah,
Wesley Brown, Randy Wayne, Joe
yeah.
Nalvin, John Weiss.
That's right. Yeah, you can see a
Looking at the
series of
Jewish,
four
it's very
questions there.
difficult to comprehend how secular Jews folks accept
Hmm.
these tenets while Hasidic. Which tenets are we talking about?
I think John Weiss needs to tell us something. He might be talking about this dispute, especially among the American Jewish community, about how the anti-Israel American Jewish community, and there's some political opposition amongst American Jews to the establishment of Israel, as we all know, and the legitimacy of Israel, and I think that might be what he's
Hmm.
talking about. So,
Where
how
does
is it?
John live?
I
Which
don't
state does
know.
he live?
Yeah, I
Because
don't
he
know. It
needs
doesn't
to
say.
get off wherever he lives because he's sitting on
Yeah.
occupied land.
Okay. All right.
Well, what I mean
Uh,
by that, I'm not trying to be
yeah.
facetious what I mean is
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
is no, there isn't a millimeter of land on Earth that
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
at some point occupied by somebody else. So
Yeah.
therefore,
That's right.
if we play the game, I
Yeah.
mean
Yeah.
the discipline of history is
Hmm.
literally a forensic accounting of who did what to whom, when, and where, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we were to sit and wallow over what happened 300 years ago or 60 years ago then none of
Hmm.
us could have ever done anything in our lives because we would
Hmm.
still be fighting over what my home was
Hmm.
stolen and occupied, literally my home in Beirut, by Palestinian refugees.
Hmm.
My
Yeah.
parents were kidnapped by Fatah and tortured. Many bad things happened to us. It's horrible, it's tragic, it's part of my personal history. I've moved on and I've hopefully done something meaningful in my life. I didn't
Hmm.
go and bomb places. I didn't create terrorism against Palestinians. That's the organic nature of how lands move from what. So we don't need to talk about who owns the land of Israel, because if we use a historical argument, then certainly they have the oldest ancestral claim to that land. But I
Hmm.
don't think that's relevant. There is a reality today that Jews exist in this land that is now existent in its current modern form since 1948. We can either accept it and hopefully live as co-neighbors and we can both flourish, or you can keep raising your children. And I say you keep, meaning Palestinians, keep raising your children straight out of the womb to say, inshallah, one day we will eradicate all Jews. That is a fact that is enmeshed within the teachings of Islam. It is in the charter of Hamas. It is in every conversation when I speak to someone in Arabic. How do we kill all the Jews? And so the bottom line is Israel is not likely to go away unless you exterminate every Jew in Israel. So how about you stop trying to eradicate a people? Let's get along. Let's build a great co-societies next to each other and stop doing the forensic accounting of who owns what.
Yeah, and of course, prior to the establishment of Israel and the whole settlement of the Middle East post World War II, um, this kind of mixed society was actually quite widespread throughout the Middle East. There was a fairly substantial Arab population in Israel, and in countries that are outside of Israel, there were a lot of Jewish people there as well. So it was a society that had the potential for that sort of thing. And yet, of course, as we've seen, the population of Jewish people in places like Saudi Arabia and Syria and those kinds of places, they've gone down precipitously, and
They're
um,
non-existent. I mean, in
uh,
Lebanon, there's
yeah,
now 40. The latest sort of unofficial
yeah,
census is that there may be 40 hidden Jews in Lebanon. That, in other words, that they
wow,
don't practice
wow,
Judaism openly. They got married to someone in
yeah,
1967 who was
yeah,
Christian. And yes, they are Jewish, but they don't practice Judaism. There's no Jewish community. And
yeah,
it's, as you said, it's true in Afghanistan and in Yemen and in Egypt and in Syria and in Libya and in Tunisia and in Algeria and in Morocco and in Iran. What happened to the Jews? Okay, you don't want to talk about Jews. What happened to the Christian communities? You don't want to talk
yeah,
about that. What happened to the Zoroastrian? What happened to
yes,
the Baha'i? So,
yes,
yes, there have been coexistence in those regions, but it's very important for your viewers and listeners to understand what coexistent means in the ethos of the Middle East. Coexistence means we tolerate you until we don't, right? There's
yeah,
a Quranic principle called dhimmi. Dhimmi
hmm,
means it's not even a second class citizen, it's a third class citizen.
Yeah.
Know your place, Jew, right?
Yeah.
So if I have design on your beautiful daughter and I come to you and ask her in marriage, do the right thing, Jew. So yes, we
Hmm.
tolerate you. I mean, it is true, it is incontestable that Jews have existed in Islamic lands, but it always ends up badly because at some point there's a catalyst that says, yeah, we've had enough of tolerating the Jews. And when that
Yeah.
happens, Gad Saad, 11 years old, puts on his really fancy sneakers and runs really fast so that his head is not detached from the rest of his body. So coexistence has a very different meaning than the way it is used in the West.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of us in the West don't really understand that. They're remarkable ignorance about the history of the Middle East, and even actually, I have to say, remarkable ignorance of the history of the United States. I mean, I
Yeah,
live in upstate New York, and there's a resurgent group of the Iroquois nation, and making claims that oh, we were here first. Why did you take our land away? And these kind of things. But of course, the existence of the Iroquois here is predicated upon, the driving out of other tribes, like
exactly.
the Mohawk or the Algonquin or those kinds of things. So this kind of argument that, oh, we were here first, it just astonishes me that it still has legs because everyone is there where they are by conquest of some sort, I think, and that's what we have to deal with. So
Exactly.
okay, so Wesley Brown asked a question. By the way, John Weiss closes with a compliment. He's waiting for your book to arrive, so he's clearly
Oh, thank you.
looking to buy it. And so, thank you, John, for
Thank you,
that.
John.
And anyway, Wesley Brown asked an intriguing question. He's saying, enjoying the discussion. Is there any room in your thinking for the a priori God
For
from
the
Dr.
odd
Wesley?
what?
A priori, as opposed to a posteriori, a priori, the previous God. I'm not sure what the
The
previous
previous
God
God?
is. GAD, you.
So sorry, maybe I need to read that question because I don't understand
Yeah,
the structure of that question. Hold
yeah.
on. Where is he? Is
It's
he
Wesley.
towards the end?
Yes, it's Wesley Brown. He's got a
Wesley Brown, enjoying
green
discussion.
icon
Any
there.
room in your
Yeah,
thinking for the a priori God? I have no
yeah,
idea what that means. Which a priori God? Which God is that?
yeah. We all have a priori
I
selves, don't we?
mean,
It's
yesterday I was a priori God to today. I don't know what that means.
yeah, yeah. He, yeah, I don't either, I have to say. Maybe he could elaborate on that.
If he
And
does, I'd be happy to take a
uh,
shot at answering it. But
yeah,
right.
yeah. So, anyway, let's see, carry on down. Tom Conklin, who has not, we're not heard from yet. So let's look at his question. He's down towards the end as well. He says the history of the world is dominate and colonize. The myopic view of those complaining is unconscionable, kind of related to the topic that we just were speaking about.
Exactly. I mean, look,
Yeah.
in the parasitic mind, I talk about the the dominant and ubiquitous Jewish tribes that were in Arabia, what is modern day
Mhm.
Saudi Arabia, where Muhammad
Mhm.
was, right? I mean,
Yes.
one of the reasons for the animus of Muhammad towards the Jews is because
Mhm.
he went to the Jews and said, "Okay, I'm the final prophet," and they said, "Ah, yeah, sorry, we're good. We already have
Mhm.
our monotheistic
Mhm.
beliefs," and he wasn't very happy about that. So I mean, the day that Israelis should walk away from land that certainly from an ancestral historical perspective they have claim to, I'll be happy for the Israelis to leave right after all the Jews are reinstated in Saudi Arabia, right?
Mhm.
But we recognize that history is in flux, right? And if we did that, there'd be no end to it. I mean, let's
Yeah.
just do Europe. How many people have lived in places today that weren't theirs 400 years ago? So it's such
Yeah.
a losing, ridiculous proposition. Why don't
Yeah.
you accept reality? That doesn't mean you forego the fact of your history,
Mhm.
right? Whenever my personal history is relevant to a discussion, I share it. But I don't wallow in it. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, I defined my success in the fact that I have overcome those tragedies, right? That's what makes me successful in life. I
Yeah.
don't expect to get any reparations from Palestinians because they stole everything from us in Lebanon. It was
Hmm.
tragic. I've moved on.
Yeah. Yeah. And one wishes this kind of attitude prevailed. I mean, people do thrive, and almost wherever they're planted. And but this kind of historical ignorance of the Middle East is a real problem. I often get in trouble by pointing out to people that, well, okay, if you look at the Middle East, all right, it was Jewish for a long time, and until about 700 AD, uh, the Byzantine Empire was Christian. In fact, the original spread of Christianity was not to Europe, right? As we know, it was actually to the east, to around the Red Sea and into areas that are currently strongly Muslim, and that Muhammad was a relatively late interloper. So who was there first? Was it and who has the right to be there by that argument? And again, without realizing that people adapt, they flourish, they make their own worlds. We're really not going to get anywhere. So, okay, I see that we're close to the end of our time. Let me just mention a few things about this webinar series and about the National Association of Scholars, and then, God, I will give you the last word. But before I do
Sure.
so, let me just say a close here. So, thanks again for joining us today. And I just want to put in a few plugs for the group I work for, the National Association of Scholars. This webinar, among other things, is sponsored by that group. And I hope you enjoyed our webinar today. We're a membership based organization. And if you're already a member, thank you so much for your support. And if you enjoyed the webinar, but you're not a member, you're always welcome to come back. We're public, but maybe consider joining us because we're a fun group. I just also want to say that if we didn't get to your comments today, I apologize. We only have so much time, but this video will be available as soon as we're done here on the to the public on the NAS YouTube channel. The links I posted in the chat box with links to God's personal webpage and links to his books and those kinds of things. They'll be posted in the comments section. But of course, you're all welcome to post comments there, and we do monitor that. And if we didn't get to your question, please post them there, or you can email your questions to me at my email address. It's turner@nas.org, and I'll do my best to see that we'll get you an answer of some sort. So, God, you have the last word.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, first, what a pleasure it is to have had this chat with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Maybe I'll end it on, I guess, an intellectual plea. You can't see it here, but I'm in my study and I am surrounded by this massive personal library of books, many of which I've yet to read. And I often wake up in a panic that am I going to have enough time to read all of these glorious books that I keep collecting, assiduously and feverishly. And so my plea to people is there's so much beautiful stuff to learn. Life is short. Don't wallow in hate and in tribalism and Trump is an existential crisis, so on. There's just play in all ways. This conversation was a form of intellectual play. Reading is a form of play. Just get out there, read, have fun, be productive, and hopefully good things will happen. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
And on that wonderful note, thank you, Gad Saad, for joining us today on Restoring the Sciences. And we
Thank
hope
you,
to see
guys.
you
Cheers.
soon.